I'm Chip Roper. I live and work here in New York, and I'm Made to Flourish. One of Made to Flourish's representatives to this in the city. Made to Flourish is a network of pastors where we we equip pastors to connect Sunday to Monday with resources and training. And Stan is my co-host and partner in this work. Stan, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll briefly introduce Dave and Missy, and then Missy will jump into your deck. So, Stan.
Hey guys, excited to see you guys join us for this webinar with Missy. My name is Stan Thomas. I'm born and raised here in New York City, so excited to be serving alongside of you guys. Along with Made to Flourish, I have the privilege of serving as a pastor at a church in Lower Manhattan, in Chelsea, New York, and so called the Gallery Church. And so I'm excited to be able to not only help host this with Made to Flourish, which is a phenomenal organization to just kind of help pastors make sense of this concept of work and how to connect it with the people that we serve and shepherd. But I'm also excited to be able to learn and listen in on this conversation. So grateful to have you guys here.
Great. Dave Wiedis has joined us as a kind of a co-panelist, and Dave leads an organization called Serving Leaders. They're based in Philadelphia, and he's been a friend and mentor to me. But Dave, you want to say just a little bit about what you guys do?
Sure. Great to be with you all. Serving Leaders Ministries is a ministry that basically shepherds. I asked the question many years ago, who cares for those who care so deeply about the body of Christ? And so we focused on shepherding their hearts, working with pastors and ministry leaders, primarily through counseling. And we do a lot of coaching, a lot of teaching, as well as mediations. There's something that the body of Christ doesn't need, right? Mediations when there's disputes and conflict. So that's what we do at Serving Leaders.
Great. And then our featured guest is Missy Wallace. Missy is actually Executive Vice President of the Faith and Work Initiative at City to City, which was originally born out of Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and she's been there. I guess you started in January, right, Missy? After founding the National Institute of Faith and Work and doing just about every other career that you can do. I think Missy's actually got an amazing story and tons of capability. And so we're really delighted that she's here with us. And Missy, we'll turn it over to you. And I think you're going to share some slides with us and walk us through this. But welcome. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here. I'll pull my slides up. Nice to meet all of you all. So I want to talk about a model that a group of people have helped me put together. So it's not Missy's model. A lot of people have poured into this model, but I'll tell you about how it started, and then I'll tell you about kind of some parameters about, where it might have some weak spots or some blind spots, and then we'll go into it and we'll stop in the middle and get some points of view, et cetera, on things. But the way this came about is about a month ago, someone asked me to be on their podcast to discuss the faith and work implications of COVID-19. I was like, oh, sure, I'll do that. And then it came time to put some thought into what I would be talking about on the podcast. And I felt really challenged of how I could make any kind of generalizations about the faith and work implications of COVID-19. I have my little sister is an ICU nurse in the COVID unit in a Detroit hospital. So I was watching her have one experience. I have another friend that was getting laid off, had no work at all, furloughed, I guess, not quite laid off, but work completely gone. And then I saw just enormous numbers of people, like a lot of work, but not quite sure what they should be doing, paddling really hard, trying to pivot. What does this mean? What does this mean? Along with the logistical issues of work from home versus not work from home, which means more disease contact, et cetera. So I started trying to think about, is there any kind of patterns I can find to think through? Are there different types of work struggles that maybe if we could try to see patterns or buckets, it would be easier to apply the hope of the gospel in certain ways? And so that's how this started. I'll say it's very much a work in process. It's been evolving even over, the last few days. Sometimes I'll have one type of work in one bucket and I'll be like, whoa, that is moving to a different bucket, even as we speak. It needs to be and is continually being pressure tested by both the pastors that are working with people, the marketplace leaders working with people, as well as the people experiencing the disruption themselves. And so I've done a lot of pressure testing with pastors, and particularly pastors working with people on the socioeconomic margins. That was where I was particularly worried, maybe that we could be seeing things wrong or getting things wrong. But it hasn't been actually pressure tested with people in the margins, with the actual workers in the margins. It's more the people caring for those in the margins. And there's a lot of people have brought up that this brings out mercy and justice issues, and they're woven into this, but this is not necessarily a mercy and justice model. There could perhaps be a mercy and justice overlay. So with all that, we'll just get started going through it. The objective of this is to help church and ministry leaders plan pastoral care for those who have experienced work disruption from the crisis. And I'm just going to state a few obvious things to get us all on the same page. COVID-19 is radically impacting work environments. It's also radically impacting unemployment. I learned that as of early this week, almost 19% of our nation is unemployed now or has filed for unemployment. The denominators are slightly different, but at the time of the Great Depression, the height was 25%. So we really are experiencing radical unemployment. Many pastors are unsure how to pastor the complexity of the work disruption. The disruption highlights varying spiritual and physical needs and temptations, but it's based on one's economic flexibility and agency and their type of work disruption. So what this model really posits is that depending on your work disruption, depending on your socioeconomic flexibility and your power in the situation, you might have different spiritual and physical needs. And that I think everyone probably on this call believes that the hope of the gospel is unilateral, but the purpose of this is to try to apply it in a nuanced way to the varying needs. So very Pauline in a way, he would apply the gospel differently to people in different situations. And that if the gospel can really be a bit more true, and that whoever's in the work disruption may already believe, maybe they become believer because of this, maybe they already believe, but their functional atheism is rearing its head. If we can reinforce the gospel, the truth of the gospel in their hearts, the Holy Spirit can lead to an outward orientation that allows the body of Christ to serve each other regardless of the work situation. And so we can see that everybody has something to give in this model, not just the people with money or the people with power. Everyone in this model has something to give. And so just to give you a high level, I'm going to explain the model, and then I'm going to show you how it delineates between physical, spiritual needs and temptations, and then how that gives nuance to the hope of the gospel and to potential outward love. And so here is the base of the model. And so the model is a 2x2. I spent one of my careers in consulting, and I kind of believe every problem can be crammed into a 2x2. And so one of, this is at its basis, the problem put into a 2x2. And so the x-axis is really understanding what the day-to-day work in a normal work environment is, and refers to the level of change being experienced. And on the one side, demand is greatly, significantly increased, moving to the other side where demand has been completely halted. Now, there is also another factor that we're adding into this axis, a little bit conflating two things at once, and that is how much has the work been upended. So if it's been totally halted, you're way over here at a 0. We'll talk in a minute, some restaurants, yes, it's been totally halted, but now they're doing delivery and it's a totally different process. So it's radically upended, but it's not all the way over here to 0. The y-axis is socioeconomic flexibility and agency, and it refers to a combination of the amount of margin one has in a sustenance lifestyle and or the amount of power or decision-making agency one has in the work environment, given their position, their education, their social capital, etc. And so you can start to look at what happens when you think about different areas of the graph. And if you think about people whose work has been significantly increased, but it's pretty much the same work, if they are higher on the socioeconomic flexibility and agency spectrum, they are feeling overwhelmed and trying to keep up. Perhaps, we surmise. In pressure testing, this seems to, I get a lot of heads, yes. And so who you may think about here, think about the people managing the grocery store chains and trying to think about how we're keeping the flow of goods coming in, how we're getting the shelves restocked. Think about Zoom, the management of Zoom. Oh my goodness, right? The management of Netflix, demand going through the roof. Actually, I had nurses on here at the beginning. Nurses, for the most part, are doing the same job. Yes, they might have to dress differently and have different types of PPE on, et cetera. For the most part, they're doing the same job, lots more intensity and patience in certain regions. Overwhelmed, trying to keep up. If you stay on the top of the socioeconomic spectrum, but you move towards the halted or radically unended, I think you find people that are strategizing with an unclear path. The image might be the duck paddling so hard, trying to figure out where to go. And interestingly, hospital administrator at the beginning of this model started over here, but has moved over here. Hospital administrators, because they've had to stop all elective surgeries, a lot of their high revenue generators are now not in the hospital. They're having to totally rethink their business model. And so, for instance, my sister's hospital system just laid off 2,500 people while at the same time they have all these COVID patients. So they're strategizing with an unclear path. Restaurant owners, I think, really easy for us all to resonate with. They have been told to close their businesses. So they've either had to completely halt or think very differently about how they're serving, what their business model looks like to get food to their customers. People start moving from this square down this square. Like I've seen restaurant owners, in the news crying, I'm losing all my savings. I'm quickly moving down the socioeconomic flexibility. And when you think about the people down here, the socioeconomic flexibility started low and their work was halted and upended. You could think about the hotel cleaning staffs that have been furloughed. You can think about dishwashers at the restaurants. You think over here, those exploited and trying to progress. Think about the demand has gone up, but they were on the low agency in the workforce as it is. So perhaps the line workers for the masks, being asked to work extra shifts, work 7 days a week. The delivery workers for one of the grocery store delivery chains and for Amazon staged safety walkout a few weeks ago. And so people down here are tending to be exploited and just trying to progress, just trying to do the best that they can. And the arrows in between these suggest that there is, you're not in a fixed box. There is movement going on literally as the COVID situation progresses and as people's personal situations progress. So I talked to a dry cleaning, somebody that owned a dry cleaning chain, and the chain was closed. And he would have said he started here. He was kind of strategizing, trying to figure out what to do. And what he figured out is he can't claim anyone's closed right now. So he's really kind of moved to no work at all. And he's seeing himself move down into this quadrant. He's moving down into this quadrant. But I've had some pastors, we can talk about this later, work with me. One of the issues of what we lead to is a lot of pastors may end up pastoring more people down here they've never pastored before, but that people that are dropping into here temporarily that may be able to pop back up quickly, very different issues than systemic brokenness. of people who started down here to begin with. So I'm getting into some of the complexities in it a bit early, and so we'll keep going and bring that back up. So you can start to think about, you can use this on an individual level or a more corporate level of a whole congregation or a whole department in a workplace or a whole company. And you can start to think about where would my people have started at the beginning of this when it first hit, and where might I see people I'm working with move, and how am I caring for them as they move? And so you might see a lot of pastors may, their work was fairly predictable at the beginning, and they were, had some socioeconomic flexibility. They quickly moved over to this box. I have no idea what to do. How am I going to get all my Sunday services up online by Sunday? How am I going to do this? How are we going to do small groups? How am I going to care for who's sick? And now some of them are not getting their giving in, and so they're starting to move down like this. So you can think about that by industry, by job type, by actual person named John that you're going to see for coffee on Sunday. And so then you can start to think, what might be the probable spiritual needs that exist because of the work disruption experience and where they started in agency and flexibility. And so you might find that in this top right group, these exhausted and trying to keep up people, they need to really avoid self-reliance and almost this moving to, it's all on me, I am God. If the whole thing is going to fall apart without me. Anxiety relief, Sabbath, and there's probably some idolatry examination that needs to take place, but maybe not in the heart of the discomfort. But it's probably bringing up some idolatry examination about how is my identity tied to my work and my need to be God in this situation almost. I really think about Dr. Fauci and think about his role and like how it really must feel that so much hinges on him. And how he must be I don't know if he's a Christian or not, but he must be experiencing this box. He's kind of going back and forth between these two probably. Then you move over to strategizing with an unclear path. And you think about these people thinking, am I okay if I fail? What if this goes wrong on me? What if I'm the one that takes this down because I don't get this strategy figured out before we run out of money? Anxiety relief also, Sabbath also a little bit of idolatry examination around who am I if I fail? Am I good enough? Down here, we maybe have some different spiritual needs, but are similar below the socioeconomic kind of midpoint sustenance line when you start moving into what you might be considered the margins or poverty. If they have a lot of work going on, there really is a high probability that they may be being exploited. And so to believe God is just, to believe God sees them, anxiety and Sabbath, I think is true for nearly every quadrant here, but to believe God is just. Interestingly, these people for the first time are actually getting a lot of celebration though also. Like a year ago, how would we have ever believed that we'd be celebrating grocery clerks? So I think that is one way we can serve the other quadrants is celebrating those being perhaps exploited. This quadrant down here, to believe God cares about my well-being. I think this quadrant gets very hard also because this quadrant has the highest number of physical needs. So again, you see the arrows and you see potential movement between quadrants and you see fear. I think this quadrant is scared of this quadrant. This quadrant is real scared of moving down into this quadrant. This quadrant is scared of moving over to this quadrant. This quadrant is scared of moving over to this quadrant. And if you think about the physical needs, people above the line that are they probably feel that they need energy. They probably are not resting well. Probably a whole lot of them need childcare. The ones on the right side of the quadrants also are probably less likely to be working from home, not not necessarily one-to-one, but anyone that is not being able to work from home is experiencing health issues. Am I being exposed to the virus? I guess danger of health issues. Right. But down here on the left, we see a whole lot of food and shelter needs. And I think we have to think about the physical needs and combined with the spiritual needs, because in the whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's really hard to meet someone at the spiritual place when they have high physical needs.
And Missy, say more about your sister, because that was the childcare thing was a big issue for her.
Point. Yeah, and let's just stop for a minute, and I'll answer that question. Then I'd love to get David and Stan's just take on this before we move into the hope of the gospel. So my sister, I would say my sister is a single mother, and she has a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and she is the nurse manager of the COVID ICU for this particular Detroit hospital. So she's really not on the front line. She's really like 1.5 line. She's managing the nurses in the rooms. She's exposed, but she's not like in the room, doing the suction. She's managing the nurses doing that. She is so tired. She has just called me just bawling, crying, completely overwhelmed, very tired, very angry, a lot of displaced anxiety. And then her children are out of school. And so they started with a neighborhood child care kind of consortium where they traded days for the people that had essential jobs that were still going to work. And she got kicked out of that because they thought she was having too much exposure that they didn't want. And so she's ending up paying a very large percent of her salary to have a nanny come in while she's on her duty. And she would be quickly moving down the grid right here. But she has a sister that's willing to help her, and she has an ex-husband who has some financial flexibility to help her. If she didn't have those, she could very quickly fall down into this quadrant, just merely because of the child care issue.
Wow.
Let's stop for a minute and say, what are your thoughts on just David and Stan on the quadrants and on how we're thinking about the needs?
I think it's a great way to lay out the diversity of needs within a congregation that people have pastoral care over, and to start to sensitize oneself to the movement. I hadn't thought about the movement, and some of that movement from one quadrant to another can be very rapid.
Yeah. And
so it exposes, it really lays out the pastoral care needs that one would see from a pastoral perspective. Mm-hmm. Very, very good.
I just want to interject. If you're an attendee, you want to chat in an example that you see of somebody in a quadrant or moving from a quadrant, chat that in. If you have a question that's already raised from the model, use the Q&A button, put that in, so we'll keep interacting on this. But yeah, great thought.
One of my friends that's a pastor in Phoenix that's helped me a lot think about the bottom left quadrant, because he spent 20 years focused on that quadrant. And that's his work. That's his mission. That's his people. That's like where his whole ministry is. He's talked to me a lot about perhaps something is that maybe COVID work disruption for mass people is exposing problems that have systemically existed for people on the margins all the time. So maybe we are being awoken to issues that have existed systemically. And so there's systemic brokenness and there's situational brokenness. Mm-hmm. And maybe a lot more people jumping into something in situational challenges, we can begin to start to dream in a post-COVID world about structural changes. That's down the road.
Interesting.
Missy, I'm also intrigued by the idea of the revealing, Kurt Thompson talked about the COVID is revealing our anxiety. I like this issue of it's revealing our idols.
Yes.
And, the way you expressed it was how identity is tied to work. And so that's a great area of exploration for, pastoral ministry for anybody, right? Is for ourselves first, but then also to start to explore how has this revealed some of the idols in our hearts, our ruling passions that really can sabotage our lives if we're not aware of it. And so in other words, in some ways, this can be just an opportunity for grace. It's a severe mercy, to use another
Yeah.
phrase.
Yeah.
You know, for us to be able to go after some of the issues in our own hearts.
Mm-hmm. I met with someone yesterday who was a senior leader at in an oil and gas organization. He was a CEO. He wasn't just senior leader. Can you think of anything? Well, there's a lot of hard things right now, but I think being a CEO of a oil and gas organization would be a very hard role to be in. Sorry, my slides are going crazy on their own. Sorry.
One other point that occurs to me, probably on all these, on some of these quadrants, would be isolation and loneliness.
Yeah.
Because it's really revealing. You know, what happens when we're alone and we're used to not being alone.
Mm-hmm.
And also, like for ministry leaders, a lot of ministry leaders have a lot of identity wrapped up in the size of their audience and getting amens, right? Getting affirmation. So I've been working with a number of pastors who are saying, I'm looking at a screen and I'm preaching to either an empty room where we're videotaping, or I'm preaching to a screen. And where's the affirmation?
Well, it's on the other side of that. The interesting thing is that then I've also talked to a pastor that said, oh my gosh, now I can see that 483 people turned into my service, but then I can click on the guy down the street service and 623 signed into his. And so now it's this like all at once, no energy from the people, but this unbelievable uber quantification of me versus
scorekeeping, major scorekeeping all the time.
Yeah.
Yep. Comparison issues. Yeah. So I think those are very significant, ministry issues for, pastors as well as others.
Stan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of agree with everything you guys have shared. Like seeing this, everything broken down to 4 quadrants. Pastoring a church made up of, right brain and left brain folk, we've been experiencing just kind of slowly just fear and being able to have this grid. You see kind of where it's been so helpful to see kind of what people are exactly dealing with as they're moving. There is this movement happening with everyone. There isn't an industry that was left untouched. And it's been, kind of, in our congregation, there's an eye doctor, which is, every Indian parent's dream that their kid should become. And, they're not at work, and suddenly you see them moving. And as I'm watching this chart, and it makes sense, just the agility that's required for shepherds to see everything at the same time, know how to pastorally lead their congregation as they're shifting now. This is good. Thank you.
By the way, I forgot to mention, I've got a download for a workbook for you all at the end with all of this. So if you're taking notes, you don't have to take notes. I have the slides for you.
Unless, of course, you're a visual learner and it helps you to take notes.
Yes, which I am, by the way.
Yeah. So, Missy, we got a couple comments coming in. I wanted to throw them out. Okay. So one person just said a change that they see is funding changing for people in parachurch ministry. So there's a shift. They have a clear plan, they might be in the upper right quadrant, but if they don't have a clear plan, they can be more in the upper left quadrant, still sliding. It's like everybody's afraid to be in the bottom left. Like that's the kind of thread. Here's a question. Rochelle asked, would you say that a parent and a child are in the same quadrant, or could they be in different quadrants?
It's a great question. So I would say they could be in different quadrants because I have 3 children home. Mine are older. Mine are age 18 to 22. And mine are still financially dependent on me. So they'll be in my socioeconomic flexibility group, but they have education, so they have a good amount of agency. I'm thinking through this. I would say 2 of my kids are kind of right here, or I don't know, right here. and
Mm-hmm.
I'm over here. I'm having to do more strategizing. My husband is right over here. His work is, he advises entrepreneurs, so he's doing the same thing a whole lot more frequently, trying to help them not go out of business.
Right.
It's a good question.
So it could be mixed. It just
Yeah, it could be
depends.
mixed.
Yeah.
So-
Especially with adult kids. Dave, you're going to add something?
Yeah, just to flesh that out, my son just graduated from law school with the promise of a job at a large law firm, but most of the large law firms are now delaying coming on board until January.
Yeah.
And I have a daughter who is an artist, and she was basically selling her art at various fairs, fairs and things like that. They're all shut down. So, they're in the quadrant as
So
well.
they're moving down.
Yep.
So if you think about the hope of the gospel, and this is, I think, kind of the meat of the model, is that thinking about the quadrants is it's where is their pain, and therefore what do they need from the unilateral gospel. And so the top right quadrant, they need to be reminded that God is in charge. And by the way, on all the quadrants you see these blank slots, it's to suggest this isn't a one answer size fits all. These are suggestive. There may need to be some contextualization, and I'll give you work pages for that. But in the top right quadrant, you need to know, Dr. Fauci needs to know God is in charge. He has got this, even though it doesn't feel like it. We are working for Christ, not for man. God prepared our work beforehand as image bearers. Perhaps some identity issues as well, but maybe not right in the pain point. Strategizing with the unclear path. God is on his throne. Jesus draws us to him in failure. We are righteous through Christ, not our work. Our identity is in our relationship, not our output and our success. And I find that there's a bit of similarity between the people above the line socioeconomically and then down towards the margin. There tends to be a bit of similarity down here too. So on the bottom right, God makes good from suffering. We serve a suffering Savior who felt forsaken. That would be true on both of the bottom quadrants. A lot of God cares about justice for the needy. And in the new heaven and the new earth, all sad things will become untrue. And I love this over here. He is our refuge. And a pastor gave me just a beautiful example. I mentioned it. The guy with the dry cleaners, it's his father, this pastor's father. And he's like, my dad does not have a retirement savings figured out. He is 70 something. His business is cratering. He cannot meet his lease payments. When are the dry cleaners going to open back up? When will anybody ever need clothes dry cleaned again? They're on Zoom every day. And his son is like, oh, are you stressed? He's like, I'm not worrying tomorrow beyond what I need to worry about today. God will provide for me. He's just like this beautiful example of God as our refuge, like incarnate. So I think these lead to the outward love we were talking about. And so every single quadrant has something to share and give. I think part of the church's role in this, and part of even marketplace leaders' roles, are to think about not only what can I personally share and give through, the encouragement of the Holy Spirit, but how can we think about some structural or corporate-led solutions between quadrants? How can we think about platforming maybe people in lower quadrants for people in some of the more socioeconomic flexible quadrants to learn? And so I want to talk about down here, this quadrant, the people that have been down here before COVID can really teach a lot about resilience and reliance on God. We really need to be looking to learn from that. These people, we did not go over the temptations. My slides went crazy. So anyway, there's temptations that come with the spiritual needs and the physical needs. And one of the temptations for the people up here is to start to exploit further those below the line, particularly down here. More shifts, work harder, work faster. And as you're starting to exploit people with no agency, we have the opportunity to make sure we offer fair treatment as the Imago Dei, to understand their needs, give them voice, celebrate the work. We're starting to see grocery clerks be the big heroes. Also, people up here need to be thinking about, both at an individual level as well as perhaps churches at a corporate level, how are the haves sharing with the have-nots? Both people with money sharing to people that are really in need of food and shelter right now, but also how are churches with resources getting resources to churches without resources? And this group also has a lot of opportunity to offer community and childcare back to this group. So I've heard of a couple churches organizing people that are out of work, organizing the childcare for people on the front line to the extent possible within the stay-at-home limitations of your community. But if there's someone completely out of work that could gift back childcare to the frontline healthcare workers who can't be at home with their children and their single parents, how can that be done safely? How can we think about getting people employed? How can we think about employment sustenance and assistance? I was on a webinar the other day that was talking about, what if everybody that has financial flexibility right now made sure that they could outsource things to other people in their church that need work, or outside their church that need work? What if everybody, if thriftiness becomes in because of this, well, could we think about thriftiness in a different way? Like, what is life-giving to employment? So can everyone that has flexibility offer employment around caring for, if they live in cities with yards, their yards, or helping with their housekeeping, or like, what are ways that we can give employment back into the system?
Hey, Missy, we have a question that kind of relates to some of this from Charles Teague. He says, there's been this systematic issue with the marginalized in the past, but it sounds like what he's suggesting is that there is more attention on their needs right now because, we're hearing news reports about it and people are talking about it. And even as an interesting thought that the scattered church tends to be more effective at reaching the marginalized because they're scattered and they're present to the marginalized more than sometimes the gathered church. And his question is this just a phase of attention, or is there some shift that needs to take place for it to be more sustainable? Does that make sense?
I don't know the answer, but I think it's a great opportunity for a shift, because I think that, some of the people that have been at the margins for a long time, now that some people that typically haven't been have dipped in, and everyone's like, oh, let's help you. And some of the people down that have been living there are like, hello, we've been
here all along. Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's frustrating, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity that a whole new group of people sees the challenges and sees some of the structural brokenness that exists. But it's a group of people that may be able to pop back up pretty easily because of their education, because of their social capital, because of whatever, because they don't have perhaps some of the things that have created systemic brokenness for them. And so I think really the opportunity for the church and for the Christian is to try to think about this beyond COVID, of what did we learn about structural brokenness versus situational brokenness that we need to address.
Great.
I hope that's helpful.
That is helpful.
So I'll just tell you real quickly, and then we can move to Q&A. There's a workbook here that has questions for practitioners for self-reflection, organization reflection, and what should I do differently on Monday reflection, both in my sermons, in my services, and my offerings. And then there's charts for how can you think about your exact context, their needs, their temptations, some questions about how to interview for the pain, both individually or through group surveys, as well as how you want to nuance the hope of the gospel for your context in your sermon series or in your one-on-one meetings or the way you're managing your group at your office, and how you can lead others towards outward love. So just to let you know, that's all downloadable for you. But let's move back to Q&A and we'll pull the model up.
Great. And folks, you can type in on the Q&A, or if you raise your hand, I'll unmute you and bring you in to the conversation. Missy, while we're waiting, anxiety is in every quadrant. What are your thoughts? Like, what's your 3-step magic formula for anxiety? Well, there isn't one, but I'm saying, what do you think? How do we help people deal with their anxiety, and what isn't helpful from a pastoral perspective? What do you think about that?
Well, maybe we should get David's take on that too, because I think that's his profession. But my take on it is, it's interesting. I was trying to manage the anxiety of my family by reshaping perspective over and over and over and over, but was going too far on not allowing us to sit in the pain of our losses we were experiencing. So while 2 of my children are having their senior years obliterated and won't get to graduate and won't have all that closure of these rites of passages, those were real pains. And I kept trying to reframe it as, we have our jobs, we have a place to live, we have food, and we don't have COVID. Like, come on, it's worse. And that wasn't helpful. So I think
comparing your losses to others and talking yourself out of your suffering doesn't work.
Yeah. So Brene Brown's podcast on that, called Comparative Suffering, was super helpful for me to think about empathy as an antidote to comparative suffering. But in general, I do think there is a reframing of putting this in the long-term gospel narrative of the Christian view is we should expect suffering. This is part of what we believe is given to us to steward as a way to grow closer to Christ. That being said, I'm not experiencing no food and shelter. So the anxiety I have is, can I figure my work problem out, and are my children going to get to go back to school? I'm not experiencing the anxiety of, can I have peanut butter on our table on Friday?
Yeah, it's above the line anxiety.
Yeah.
It's
Self-actualization anxiety and comfort and security anxiety versus sustenance anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Dave, add anything to that?
Well, let me hear the question first. I know you're talking about anxiety, but what was the exact question about anxiety, Chip?
Well, it's in every quadrant. So it's sort of like, well, how do we help people deal with it, I guess,
right,
from a pastoral point of view?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, my definition of anxiety is when we import our imagination of a future event into the present, and then we respond, our bodies and our minds respond as if it's happening right now. So one of the key things to manage anxiety is to understand that that's what I'm doing. A lot of what I'm worried about oftentimes does not come about because we tend to catastrophize and think about worst case scenarios. So that's sort of an overview of how I would approach anxiety. But as Missy was saying, there's real anxiety and there's real pain that we need to enter into and be able to listen to and be with people. I do think the idea of comparison, it's interesting. What I've been doing personally is I've just been cultivating a grateful heart to God for all the provision that I do have, whether it's a hot shower, whether it's breakfast, etc. But just cultivating that gratefulness, and you can do that, where you are, wherever you are in the quadrants.
Yeah, I read something recently that anxiety is pretty much your first definition of it, Dave. It's a forward-looking, catastrophizing type of thing. And this writer was Neil Anderson, and he said fear is different. Fear is our reaction to a threat
that is present and potent.
Except that you can imagine something, and it doesn't have to be present or potent, but you can have real fear. Because I know a lot of people having
It's more
anxiety
intense.
attacks and panic attacks
Right.
as they're thinking about things that may or may not come about.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And maybe as you slide down in the bottom of this, you know, at least from an social economic sustainability point of view, you get into that more. There are real threats. You know, it's kind of like and it becomes
Losing your house, losing your business.
or you're exposed to the disease, and so there's that physical threat, and so
That's right.
it changes a little bit. So it's really interesting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Here's an idea. Track your pride on the chart. It'd be interesting to see how pride moves quadrants. You think about that, Missy.
So we didn't do the probable temptation slide, but it's very interesting. So these exhausted and trying to keep up, real high temptation to pride, high temptation to I am God, temptation to use people transactionally, and pride. Over here, pendulum could go way far on the pride side or way far on the despair side. Both of these have greed. I think down here, pride isn't necessarily the temptation, though it could be for these people that are working so hard. I think it's more likely to be despair or cynicism, or confusion between righteous and unrighteous anger, and a temptation to say faith doesn't work. But what's so beautiful is how many people are. I really think that we have so much to learn by the people who have not fallen into despair, cynicism, or faith, despite being down here chronically or temporarily.
Let's say more about that. That was another question we had. What more can we learn from the people in that lower left quadrant?
Before you jump in there, can I just also add to this probable temptations is addictions, right? I think, is it on there? Probably. Or
You're right.
So the porn use is way up. You know, I would imagine alcoholism and just medication in general, whatever that form that takes, is way up.
Is that across all the quadrants?
I would think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because people like in the upper right quadrant, when you're ignited, you feel entitled.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think that's like the really, really busy New York professional. Like, I'm entitled. I'm working so hard. I deserve to do whatever's going to make me feel good. B,
Right.
I'm better than everybody else, so I can get away with this stuff. And so I think that it's a combo that comes together to feed some of that addictive behavior.
Yeah. Plus the isolation that most people are experiencing.
And I can afford the, self-medication of my choice.
Mm-hmm.
So it's readily accessible. Yeah, probably.
To answer your question you read, Chip, I think we need to find a way to listen to people in the bottom quadrants and the top quadrants, not thinking they need to be God to solve the problems, but rather the real opportunity of what we can learn from them is the broken systems that we are complicit in creating that we do not see, that perhaps they can point to and help us with.
And as you articulated, at least a subset of them, folks in that group, have learned how to be content, which their mirror opposites have not. Like they're just sort of chronically discontent. So there's probably something there too.
Yeah.
What other questions do we have?
One more thing. I think this group can show this group so much about their idolatries of comfort and security and, control. Because these people have learned to be thankful, not just in plenty, but also in want.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times these people, Christianity is a self-help tool that is secondary to self-reliance, I'm doing just fine meeting all my needs for my happiness charter. And so I think there's something to be said about blowing up some idolatries around comforts.
That's really good. It's really good. It's really interesting. It's, there's a quote, Peggy Noonan wrote it in the Wall Street Journal, that we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat.
Mm.
And I think your grid really, really, I mean, it shows us that, like, in living color. It's really powerful. We got a question that came in. Meeting the needs of singles. How can we do that through our churches? Is there an avenue there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's an avenue all over the place. So, I mean, maybe there's an avenue for seniors. There's an avenue for, and I think that goes to the, I don't know exactly if the question asker wants to give a little more nuance about what needs of the singles you're talking about. Are you talking about the isolation?
Yeah, isolation, needs for community.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a variety of solutions that you could think about in this slide through the hope of the gospel. So the people that maybe have gotten over here, no work, can they somehow organize to somehow, they're not as busy, they have nothing to do, perhaps? Can they somehow organize to figure out how to be community to the singles in some kind of structural way through the church?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when we're working with people through job search at Voca, especially if it's extended, volunteering actually becomes a best practice for them. I mean, obviously they're benefiting others by serving them, but it becomes a best practice for them, because they're getting out of, it's all about me, I just have to find a job, I just have to, and they're investing in others, and which is the outward love that the gospel drives us to. Here, Laura's added some color to her question. Think of isolation, lack of touch, maybe lack of working, potential even nobody's checking in on them to make sure they're eating well. She thinks, well, maybe we could encourage families to adopt a single. There could be other ways to actually organize that.
Yeah, I love those ideas. Like, what if one of the takeaways for a pastor here is to write down every single person that they think in their congregation is experiencing extraordinary isolation, and give that to a group of volunteers and say, can y'all figure this out?
I think Mark, haven't you got Mark Snyder's on? Haven't you guys? I'm just gonna bring you up. Haven't you guys done some things where you've called everybody in your church to make sure that you checked in on them and that kind of thing?
I think lots of the singles that I know that have a little bit of socioeconomic flexibility have ended up leaving the city.
Yeah, they've gone back home.
They've gone to stay.
They're back in their childhood bedrooms, and that's keep the therapist busy for a long time.
One of the things that occurs to me is even inviting people to have dinner together on Zoom. Our church actually on Good Friday, we had a dinner that was hosted, by the church, and basically we had 40 or so families that you could, and people had all their meals and things like that, and it was just a time of being together, and people can mute or not.
We get on Zoom and play these trivia games that are linked to Zoom, and put questions up on the screen that you can answer and things with our single mothers, our senior single mothers.
It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative. Hey,
Right.
Mark, do you want to chime in on that idea of caring for singles and checking in? I think you guys were doing you had an initiative around that.
Yeah, one of the things we have a caring committee, and right now I've been chairing that, so it kind of fell right to me immediately. How are we caring for our people? So at first we identified people in our church who were struggling, the elderly who were alone, and then we were kind of organically moved into, all right, who are the healthcare workers? And really, I have a great team. There are about really 10 of us, and we're on a call every 2 weeks. And then we moved to, all right, let's reach out to the whole church. And it's a smaller church, so we're, you know, each of us had the responsibility of checking in on 5 people, say. But, you know, within a short period of time, we covered everybody. And then, of course, you hear about what's happening in the greater community just organically. So we've been able to, you know, as a small church, we were able to kind of be nimble through that process.
What did you discover? I'm sorry, Missy, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would just be really interested if everyone that's a guest on the call would put through the chat to everyone where you feel like the majority of people that you're influencing or interacting with, which quadrant they're in. Upper right, upper left, bottom left, bottom right, just out of curiosity. But go on, Chip.
I was going to ask Mark, just like, what have you discovered through that process of checking in with everybody in your congregation, and have you seen any of the movement, the work quadrant movement that Missy outlined for us?
It's kind of eking out, you know. That's not the first thing people will bring up. So especially now, I think in a few weeks we're gonna know more. So it was only in a private conversation, a one-on-one, and it happened to actually be one of the few conversations I've had in person with someone that I heard that he had been struggling, and he's in upper management at a firm, and so his job, he didn't lose his job, but his pay was cut 25%. And so I think a lot of what's happening is if the on the surface conversations aren't happening, you know, even the how are you doing, obviously you're not going to bear that. But I think the deeper conversations of haven't all happened yet.
Yeah.
I think people have a lot of shame around their work too, if it's not going well. I think they don't want to talk about it.
I think that's a particularly white collar problem, maybe, Chip.
Really?
Maybe.
It could be.
But there is a question here. Let's see if I can find it. About some people have said, well, how do I even know what quadrant they're in? So we can talk about interviewing for their pain. Basically, tell me about your work stress. Has your workload increased or decreased? And what's driving that? What kind of pressure is on you to perform? Do you feel endangered by the virus? Do you feel secure in your housing and food? Is your childcare working? I think some version of these questions brought up in natural conversation or in group surveys can help diagnose or understand trends.
Where do you put somebody who's working, finances are fine, but work is challenging because they have to watch their kids and work at the same time?
Left. I'd say upper left, because there's a strategizing and trying to keep up with doing something in a way you're changing your normal work routines. You're multitasking. You're trying to homeschool and keep your job up.
So you don't have a rhythm. It's that you're unrhythmed, you know.
Yeah, your work is not the same. You're probably doing much more intense bursts. You're probably working late at night.
Yeah.
But that means you have a job that can be work from home. So that's one good part about it. But my colleagues that I work with, the one I work the most closely with has a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old knows my voice so well that if she's even on speakerphone, doesn't even have me on video, if she's even on speakerphone with me, the daughter starts screaming, crying to see my puppy. So we've used my puppy as a distraction element so much. So like the people with toddlers, my hat is off to you all. I don't know how I could have done that.
It's great. Got some chats coming in. Upper right and left, it sounds like a lot of in this audience. Hey, wanted to mention to everybody that Dave does a series of, you do a workshop on anxiety, right, Dave? Can people find that at servingleaders.org? Can they find that at your website?
Yeah, there's I've got some sermons that are online at servingleaders.org under resources, and then I've been doing that. There's some interviews as well, and I've been doing the sermon and interviews with pastors, and it's been very, very helpful. I'm doing it for Pennsylvania legislators next week, actually,
Wow.
just a whole workshop for them on that.
Great. So servingleaders.org for you. Missy,
Yep.
what's the best place for people to get hold of this resource?
Yep, I'm about to put it into the chat.
All right.
I'll put the website into the chat if that's okay with you, Chip.
No, please do.
So you can get the workbook and the slides downloadable at the website I just put in.
Great.
And there's on the City to City YouTube, there's a YouTube of us going over it for 20 or 30 minutes. And so if you have a particular group of pastors or co-workers or ministry directors in your organization that you want to go over it with and perhaps use it for planning, there's the YouTube there where you could get where I'm explaining it if that would be helpful.
It's great. So we've got your link in there. We've got Dave's link in there. I just put Made to Flourish in there, madetoflourish.org. And for those of you who don't belong to Made to Flourish, it's a free membership. It gives you access to resources that they have for equipping pastors to equip their people for life at work. And then I also put the URL for vocacenter.org, where we walk with people in terms of finding vocational clarity. We know job search is a big deal right now, and we have a faith-based program for that. And we also have a regular program for that. And we're doing webinars every week, every Thursday night, to just help people navigate their work world. So if any of that's of interest, we certainly want to pass that on. But so those are all follow-up pieces. Let's just kind of go around for some closing thoughts. What strikes me about all this is how dynamic it is. And one of the things I really appreciate about the model, Missy, is just how it can flex and it's adaptable, but it also, that connects it to reality. Because that's the way it is. And I mean, I really don't think which is very frustrating, by the way, but we really don't know where all this is really going to go and what it's really going to be like. It still just feels like, I heard somebody say recently, we're only in the second inning of a 9-inning game, kind of idea, which just kills us because we want resolution. But anyway, you have a model that's agile enough to deal with that, but then takes it further to think through needs, temptations, and spiritual ramifications, but then even takes us to the solution side. So it's very rich, and I'm sure it'll keep evolving, but it's just a great resource. So I love the kind of comprehensiveness of it, and I thank you for it.
Yeah. Well, it's no, you guys can, if it feels helpful and you think it could help any community, any group, use it widely. No need for credit or whatever. We just want it to help people.
Yeah, it's a great tool to give us intentionality and to be analytical about what the needs are, as opposed to, I tend to be more intuitive, and this is helpful to really plot out and really think through. Did you say? Go ahead, Miss.
The pastors I've talked to mentioned that it's really easy to be intuitive when you're pastoring people experiencing a lot of the same struggle you might be struggling, or if you're pastoring the same type of people and problems that you've been pastoring over a long career. But to the extent your people are moving into whole different quadrants than you have experienced or you're used to pastoring, you may come up against some blind spots.
Sure.
And I think that's a helpful way to think about it.
Did you say the YouTube, is that you explaining this model?
Yeah, it's a webinar where we went over it, and I'll put that in the chat box too.
That'd be helpful.
It's it's also with some pastors working on the margins, giving some input that give it much more kind of rich fabric than I necessarily can.
Great. Stan, you have any observations, questions?
No, it's exciting to know that regardless of the quadrant, just to remind ourselves as shepherds that the gospel has something to say to everyone, and that that whatever models or solutions we come
Hello,
to
everyone.
in our individual
This
churches.
is Tim Keller, and I am one of the co-founders
Sorry,
of
I
the Ministry
accidentally.
of City to City.
Somebody's trying out the link.
Years ago, and the Ministry of City to City is
Sorry, I'm trying to put the YouTube into the chat. I'm so sorry.
Our unadvertised guest.
I would say the moment I said the gospel and Tim Keller starts talking, that's kind of, but no, just it's how the gospel does speak into that. So I think that's very encouraging, at least for me as a shepherd, for just serving and leading my people. So thank you for that, Missy.
That's great. Missy, what would you say, like kind of a closing word or challenge or encouragement to the pastors on the call?
Well, two things. We're experiencing disruption, and people are experiencing disruption and pastoring disruption simultaneously.
Really
and
good.
so we got to put on our own oxygen masks. Tim Keller was giving an exhortation to a group of ministry leaders a couple weeks ago, and he talked about 9/11, and he talked about how everyone just came together and worked so hard to meet the needs for months and months after 9/11, but he saw an enormous amount of burnout and fallout of the ministry 18 months later. People were just exhausted. And so I do think we're in for the long haul, and I think we do need to do some things both at an individual level and a structural and kind of more corporate level to think about meeting needs in a nuanced way. But I think we also have to realize we're experiencing the disruption as we're part of pastoring the disruption. So let's not forget to put our own oxygen masks on.
Great. It's a great word. Stan's going to pray, and then any of you want to hang out and stay, I'll be on for a while. I don't know how long our panelists have, but we can bump you up and include you in the conversation if you want to digitally hang out for a little bit. But Stan, close us in prayer.
Absolutely. God, we thank you for the privilege we have to call ourselves sons and daughters of God. So we're grateful for that, Lord, that in the midst of all the unknowns that are around us, that we could rest on the truth that we do know, that you are God and that you are good, and that you have called us out of darkness into your marvelous, glorious light. And so, God, I thank you for Missy and the work she is doing in helping us pastors kind of shepherd our people well. And God, for the truths that we've learned today, Lord, would you allow that to help us and anchor us through the storm. And we praise you that in the midst of all of this, we can look to you knowing that the gospel still works. It's still powerful. It still awakens and transforms and encourages. So thank you for these conversations, God. Continue, even after our time together right now, continue to speak and minister to our souls, Lord. We thank you and we praise you. In the awesome name of Jesus, our Savior and your Son, we ask and pray. Amen.
Amen. All right.